Night was supposed to be peaceful at Maplewood Gardens, a condominium complex nestled behind rows of towering oaks and bright, flowering shrubs. Yet, on this particular evening, shadows seemed to lurk in every corridor. Murmurs passed through the residents' gatherings in the courtyard, hinting at a cost-cutting measure that had left the main stairwells dimmer than an abandoned movie theater. The Homeowners Association, usually the guardians of well-manicured lawns and tidy sidewalks, had flipped a switch in the name of financial responsibility. Overnight, a sense of unease replaced the familiar comfort. "There's nothing to worry about," insisted Howard Kane, the HOA's board president, during a tense meeting 2 days prior. A tall, silver-haired retiree who cultivated confidence like others might cultivate roses, Howard radiated pride in having shaved a significant chunk off the annual electric bill. The measure: keep the stairwell lights off between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m., relying on minimal emergency bulbs instead. "We're not made of money," he'd said, as if Maplewood Gardens was in the throes of a dire financial crisis. "We can't afford to waste electricity on lights no one uses at that hour." What he failed to mention was the lively foot traffic through those corridors. Residents who returned late from visits to grandchildren, from second-shift jobs, or from the simple joys of an evening stroll. For them, the stairwells were a necessity. Some had expressed unease, but the board members, pressed by shrinking funds and short-sighted solutions, had a way of dismissing concerns. After all, Maplewood Gardens prided itself on a small-town vibe, where everyone knew each other's name, but not always each other's burdens. 4 floors up, near the top of Building C, lived Harriet Malone, a 67-year-old retired nurse whose warm smile had greeted new neighbors for decades. Harriet was the type to hand-deliver casseroles to newcomers and deliver flowers to those who lost a pet. She had a knack for reading people's eyes and knowing exactly when they needed a word of kindness. But Harriet's fragile body had begun showing its cracks, her lungs especially. Asthma plagued her. Still, to see her strolling about, greeting folks in the courtyard, or bringing fresh muffins to the building's handyman, you'd never guess how often her breath felt strangled at her chest. That same evening, Harriet was in her cozy living room, crocheting a baby blanket for her daughter's soon-to-be-born child. She had done this with every grandchild. The patterns told a story in color and texture, passing a piece of herself down to the next generation. Her inhaler rested on the end table next to a lukewarm cup of chamomile tea. Outside her window, the grand oak by the building cast dancing silhouettes against the complex's outer lights. It was serene, she thought, until a shortness of breath reminded her just how tenuous the concept of serenity could be. Meanwhile, in the next building over, 72-year-old Mary Rowland, a dear friend of Harriet's, fretted over the darkness. A widow who lived alone, Mary disliked how ominous the hallways felt since the board's cost-cutting measure went into effect. She missed having the bright lights reassure her when she passed through the stairwells late at night. After all, she liked reading her mail in the building's foyer before heading up to her unit, or sometimes just strolling around for a bit of exercise. Now, the place felt claustrophobic, as if the walls were converging in the gloom. She wasn't alone in her apprehension. Quiet grumbles percolated among the other residents, especially the elderly ones who recalled how Maplewood Gardens had once been so well lit that you could read a postcard in the stairwell at midnight. Now, the atmosphere seemed cheap, forbidding. No matter how often the board insisted the measure was safe and that the minimal emergency bulbs met county regulations, people still felt the chill of uncertainty. Nor were the younger residents untouched by this shift in ambience. Serena Carter, a single mom returning from her late shift at the hospital, often carried her toddler, Oliver, up 2 flights of stairs. The overhead lights used to be bright enough to illuminate Oliver's dozing face. But with the darkness, Serena walked more slowly, hugging her child tightly and checking each step for a misplacement of her foot. Safety, she realized, wasn't just about saving money. It was about ensuring people could move without fear of a misstep. She had voiced her concerns at the meeting, but they've been drowned out by talk of electricity rates, pipeline expansions, and an uncertain future. Even the building's maintenance team found it troubling. They knew how easily accidents could happen, but they also knew the board was fixated on slashing the budget. Howard, for all his leadership airs, seemed more interested in re-election next term than the well-being of folks trudging up and down those dark landings. Lawsuits, injuries, were these risks worth the savings? Still, a hush fell over Maplewood Gardens each evening, as though an invisible curfew demanded that people retire inside. Windows glowed faintly, but the main corridors were draped in an uneasy silence. Harriet, typically unafraid and sprightly, felt that tension, too. She didn't like feeling caged in her own home, or that every late night errand down the stairs became an expedition. No one realized how swiftly and tragically this experiment in cost-saving would prove itself a perilous mistake. And so that night ended with Harriet drifting off to sleep in her armchair, her inhaler on the table, and the lights in the stairwells blanketed in the thick hush of darkness, an omen of what was soon to come. Bright and early the next day, a concerned neighbor's knock jolted Harriet from her nap. Her crocheting lay half-finished in her lap, and her legs tingled with the pins and needles sensation of having fallen asleep in an awkward position. She groaned softly and stood, inhaler in hand, just in case. Mary Rowland's face, usually warm and maternal, was now pinched with worry when Harriet opened the door. "Have you heard?" Mary whispered, glancing over her shoulder as though the walls themselves might overhear. "They're installing motion sensor lights for the stairwells, but only at the lower floors." Harriet opened the door wider, gesturing for Mary to come in. "Does that mean they're still keeping the lights off the rest of the night?" Mary nodded. "Howard says this is a compromise. At least the first-floor landing will be lit if someone comes in the main door." Harriet frowned. She found it a half measure at best. "What about the upper floors?" "Left in the dark, apparently," Mary said quietly, taking a seat. She traced her fingertips over Harriet's crocheting. "I know it sounds silly, but this has made me uneasy. What if we need to go down for something at night? If I slip or if my knee gives out?" Her voice trailed off, overshadowed by thoughts of potential accidents. Harriet's gaze drifted to her inhaler. She recalled nights when her chest tightened unexpectedly and she had to walk around the building or get some fresh air outside just to catch her breath. Climbing down a darkened staircase for fresh air suddenly seemed a risky endeavor. "We need to speak up again. They can't ignore us forever." In response, Mary shrugged. "You know Howard and the rest of them. They think we're all just panicking over nothing." And so the two friends decided to have a word with the board again. They weren't alone. A small group had formed: Serena, with her toddler, an older gentleman named Frank who had night blindness, and even the maintenance staff who quietly sympathized. The group's hope was that a civil conversation with the HOA members might sway them to see how precarious the situation actually was. But Maplewood Gardens had become a place where open hearts fought an uphill battle against tightly clutched checkbooks. When they entered the clubhouse, Howard and the board were gathered at a rectangular table, flipping through binders of numbers, charts, and projections. A heavy hush enveloped the room. Harriet felt a twinge of anxiety. She'd never been one to stage a confrontation, but she cleared her throat, stepped forward, and introduced the group. "We understand the financial concerns," Harriet began, meeting Howard's cool gaze. "But the stairwells are essential. People come and go at all hours. Some of us have medical conditions. Others have children. Cutting the lights entirely, especially on upper floors, is dangerous." "Thank you for sharing your concerns," Howard said with that measured tone he used when he wanted an argument to end before it started. "We've consulted with the county regulations, and we meet the minimum standard. The emergency bulbs on each floor are more than enough in an actual crisis." "What about a crisis that happens because we can't see?" asked Frank quietly, tilting his head. "I can't always gauge steps in dim light. A single bulb at the end of a dark hallway isn't enough." Howard pursed his lips, flipping through the binder. "We hear you," he said, barely letting Frank's words sink in. "But the vote was taken, and we have a majority's approval to continue. I'm sorry if it's an inconvenience." Harriet's voice trembled. "This is beyond inconvenience. This is about safety. If one person falls—" Howard lifted his hand. "Ms. Malone, we're not a charity. We're an HOA tasked with fiscal responsibility. The money we save in electricity costs can go toward more pressing renovations, like fixing that pool filter so it's usable for everyone. Our finances aren't infinite." Hearing that, Serena's frustration boiled. "My child's safety matters more than a fancy pool filter. If you had to carry a toddler up those stairs in the dark, you wouldn't dismiss it so casually." But Howard only frowned, glancing at his watch. "We appreciate your input, but the board has decided." That was that. They left the clubhouse feeling a collective sense of defeat. The system was rigged against them, Harriet thought grimly. It was as though a curtain of darkness had fallen not just on the stairwells, but on the goodwill that once bound their community. Maplewood Gardens was changing. The question was, into what? In the days that followed, Harriet made it a point to plan her errands while it was still light out. If she needed fresh air after dusk, she'd step on her small balcony. She was determined not to use the stairs in the late hours, especially after hearing that Frank nearly tripped one evening, fumbling around in the gloom to find the handrail. Meanwhile, Mary had begun leaving her hallway light on all night, hoping it might at least throw some illumination toward the landing. During this time, Harriet's asthma had its usual ups and downs, though she tried to keep it at bay with her inhaler and occasional doctor's appointments. She refused to let it define her. She was too proud, too used to being the caretaker, the nurse, the mother figure. Still, she couldn't shake an uneasy feeling that lodged itself in her chest. A dark stairwell was no place to find yourself short of breath. Fate, however, doesn't always wait for us to be prepared. Sometimes it comes knocking, or, more precisely, sometimes it rushes in on a gust of panic. With so many worries swirling about, Harriet found herself focusing more and more on the day-to-day tasks and less on the intangible sense of dread. Even Mary, who had been so vocal, seemed resigned to accept the new normal. But tension has a way of festering. The question wasn't whether something would happen, it was when. And then the day arrived. Or rather, the night arrived. A night when Harriet, asleep by her living room window, awoke with a start. Her chest seized up, her breath came in rattled gasps. Panic flared in her eyes as she grabbed at her inhaler, only to realize it was still sitting on the table across the room. In the heat of that desperate moment, Harriet's instincts told her she needed fresh air to move around, to do anything to force oxygen back into her lungs. And so she lurched into the hallway, heedless of the darkness waiting beyond the threshold. The hallway was a corridor of black velvet. A single flickering emergency bulb at the far end barely dented the gloom, offering more shadows than light. Harriet's vision blurred at the edges as she fumbled for the railing. Her fingertips grazed the cool metal, and she clutched it like a lifeline. There wasn't time to turn back for her inhaler. Her mind screamed for air, and in her desperate haze, she believed reaching outside might alleviate the choking sensation. She forced herself forward, step by agonizing step, her chest tight. Each breath felt like sandpaper scraping her throat. After descending half a flight, Harriet paused, leaning heavily against the wall, willing her lungs to expand. They refused to comply. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She had to keep going. Another step. The gloom felt endless. She had traversed these stairs hundreds of times in full light without a second thought, but now it was as though an invisible labyrinth had swallowed her whole. Her eyes, desperate to adjust, played tricks on her. Edges melted together, and shapes loomed where there should have been open space. She reached for the next step, but instead her foot found only air. Her right ankle twisted beneath her. Her hands shot out, struggling to grip the banister, but the slick rail eluded her frantic grasp. The world pitched forward. Harriet tumbled, hitting the stairs with a sickening thud. An involuntary gasp rattled through her starved lungs, pain exploding across her ribs and hip. Fear surged in her chest. She tried to cry out for help, but her voice came out as a hoarse rasp. A second, sharper jolt battered her as she slid another step down. The impact was too much. Pain and panic mixed into a lethal combination. Black splotches swam over her vision. Her inhaler might as well have been on the moon. Despair washed over her, and she tried to steady her breathing to cling to a fraction of calm. Her body refused. She was drowning in airlessness, pinned by agony, surrounded by darkness. And so, Harriet Malone, the kind, generous soul who had welcomed so many newcomers, lost the consciousness battle on that stairwell. No one knew exactly how many minutes passed before Mary Rowland, awakened by a persistent sense of unease, peeked out her door. She spotted something on the landing below, like a slumped shadow. Heart pounding, Mary edged closer, squinting in the dim. A horrified gasp escaped her lips as the shape resolved into Harriet, sprawled at an unnatural angle on the steps, chest barely moving. "Help!" Mary's voice shattered the quiet. She scrambled down, nearly stumbling herself, and kneeled by Harriet's side. "Hang on," she pleaded, tears burning at the corners of her eyes. Harriet's lips were pale, her breath shallow and sporadic. "Stay with me," Mary whispered. "I'll get your inhaler. Someone call 911. Her shouts reverberated through the corridor. It took mere moments for a few neighbors, Frank, a young woman named Diana, and a night owl retiree who lived on the first floor, to burst onto the landing. The phone call to emergency services was frantic, but Harriet was unresponsive, her body slack, eyes half closed. Mary ran back to Harriet's condo for the inhaler, only to find it on the table, inches from the crocheting Harriet had worked on just hours before. By the time Mary returned, paramedics were clattering up the stairs with a stretcher, shining flashlights that revealed Harriet's face drained of color. The medics worked quickly, administering oxygen and checking her vitals. But their controlled urgency sent a shiver through everyone watching. Harriet's pulse was weak. Her breathing was faint. "We need to move her now," one of the medics barked. A flurry of motion followed as they maneuvered her onto the stretcher and rushed down the steps. Mary's heart hammered as she clutched Harriet's inhaler, feeling as though she had failed her dear friend in that crucial moment. For hours that night, residents lingered in doorways and at windows, watching the wail of the ambulance lights illuminate Maplewood Gardens in harsh reds and blues. Murmurs rippled from one condo to the next, merging into a collective sense of dread and anguish. By the time dawn arrived, Harriet was in intensive care, her fragile body battered by the fall and starved of oxygen. The next day, the official news arrived. Harriet Malone, beloved friend and neighbor, had passed away at the hospital in the early hours. Her asthma attack, coupled with the injuries from her fall, proved too much for her weakened lungs to overcome. Maplewood Gardens woke to the heartbreaking reality that, in trying to save money, the HOA had contributed to a tragedy. The fallout was immediate. Shock, anger, grief. Words like irresponsible and negligent spat from the lips of residents who once greeted each other with warm smiles. The board, particularly Howard, faced a barrage of furious questions. Why had they refused to listen? Could this have been prevented if the stairwell lights had been kept on? Even county inspectors started poking around, spurred by phone calls from outraged relatives. But even as the blame game began, a heavier sorrow weighed on those who had known Harriet best. She was more than a cautionary tale or a tally mark in some legal battle. She was the gentle spirit who had been a fixture of that community for decades. Now, with her sudden death, Maplewood Gardens felt as though its heart had been carved out. The hush that descended on the halls and courtyards was different from the uneasy darkness of nights past. It was laden with guilt, mourning, and regret. In the aftermath, the quiet at Maplewood Gardens became a deafening roar of remorse. A makeshift memorial appeared near the stairwell where Harriet had fallen. Bouquets of roses, lilies, and handwritten notes from neighbors who simply wrote, "Thank you for your kindness," or "We miss you." Candles flickered, a vigil that seemed to protest the very darkness that had contributed to Harriet's final moments. People gathered on the landing, sharing tears and hugs, forging bonds out of heartbreak. Mary Rowland found herself swept into a whirlwind of emotions. Guilt gnawed at her. She replayed the night over and over, The dim corridor, Harriet's body splayed out, the frantic call for help. If only I'd checked on her earlier, Mary would whisper to herself in the confines of her condo. Sleep eluded her now. Every time she shut her eyes, she saw Harriet's pale face. She found some solace in the knowledge that she'd been the one to find her friend and try to save her. But that comfort did little to soothe her grief. Though battered by sorrow, Mary recognized she wasn't alone. Others felt it too. Frank visited the memorial daily, leaning heavily on his cane, murmuring a quiet prayer and offering Harriet a new flower each time. Serena discreetly dropped off a stuffed toy from her toddler, placing it gently beside the flowers. Even residents who'd never truly known Harriet found themselves moved by the tragedy. After all, it could have been any of them in that stairwell. A collective question wafted through the halls. Why wasn't more done? The funeral service took place a week later at a local church, where Harriet's daughter delivered a eulogy both tender and harrowing. It wasn't a large gathering, but it was packed with Maplewood Gardens neighbors who had come to pay their respects. Mary sat in the pew, tears streaming down her cheeks as she listened to stories of Harriet's generosity, her devotion to family, and her unwavering resolve to help others. Flowers that Harriet had once grown in her garden now adorned the altar. Under the gentle glow of stained glass windows, it felt as though Harriet's spirit hovered there among them, urging them all to remember the power of compassion. But compassion, they soon learned, sometimes needed reinforcement through accountability. In the days following the funeral, Harriet's daughter, Lori, demanded answers and action. She marched into the board's meeting and confronted Howard Kane, a man she'd known only from her mother's occasional stories. "Why did you turn off the lights?" Lori asked, her voice raw. "My mother is gone. She died alone, in the dark. How can you live with yourselves?" Howard's usually composed demeanor faltered. He stumbled through a half-baked explanation about finances, about how the board had a majority vote, about the minimum legal requirements. Lori, trembling with anger, brushed aside his justifications. "Minimum legal requirements?" she spat. "That's your defense?" Her eyes brimmed with tears that refused to fall. "If cutting the lights saved a few dollars, was that worth my mother's life?" In the silence that followed, Howard bowed his head, though whether out of guilt or because he had no suitable response was unclear. Other board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing the situation had outgrown their usual deflection tactics. Calls for a special meeting and a re-vote on lighting were immediate. The board acted quickly now, perhaps driven by fear of legal repercussions or by genuine remorse. Either way, the outcome was swift. The lights were to remain on throughout the night, every floor, every hallway. Maplewood Gardens discovered money in the budget, as if by magic, to pay for the electricity costs they once decried. But for many, it felt like trying to lock the stable door after the horse had bolted. The damage was done. Harriet was gone, and the sense of security that once blanketed the complex lay in tatters. Residents who had once had faith in the HOA now questioned every decision, every new policy. Some contemplated moving away, finding this tragedy too heavy a burden to carry. Others felt spurred to stand up, to advocate for a safer, more inclusive community. Mary, for her part, took on a quiet determination. She began organizing an informal residents' council, separate from the official HOA, to discuss potential changes that extended beyond just lighting. Wheelchair ramps, better signage for emergency equipment, and improved procedures for medical emergencies. "We can't let Harriet's death be in vain," she told them. "It's time we looked after each other, instead of relying on a handful of people to make decisions for everyone." Attendance at these gatherings grew quickly, especially after each meeting. Mary posted updates on the communal bulletin board. Dozens of residents, from seniors dealing with health issues to families wanting to keep their kids safe, showed up with stories and ideas. They realized Harriet had taught them, even in death, that community can't thrive when cost-saving measures overshadow basic humanity. Throughout all this, a dark cloud hovered over Howard Kane and the board. Threats of lawsuits trickled in. Lori, in particular, hinted at seeking legal counsel to investigate negligence. And while Howard tried to put on a brave face, it was clear the tragedy weighed on him. Some nights, he would pace his condo, staring at spreadsheets, wondering how a penny-wise decision could unravel lives in such a devastating fashion. He had heard the whispers around Maplewood Gardens. Harriet's blood was on his hands. Despite the swirling tensions, pockets of kindness appeared everywhere. Younger neighbors volunteered to escort elderly residents up and down the stairs at night. Light bulbs seemed to glow a little warmer in the corridors, as if paying quiet homage to Harriet's memory. People who barely spoke to each other before the tragedy now exchanged supportive nods or paused to chat, forging deeper connections. The community was wounded, but it was also beginning to heal, guided by the realization that they had to protect one another, because if they didn't, the consequences could be unspeakably tragic. A few months passed, and though Maplewood Gardens carried on, the lingering effects of Harriet's death remained like an old scar. People took daily comfort in the restored illumination of every stairwell. The lights, once considered a frivolous expense, now stood as silent sentinels against a repeat of that dreadful night. And yet, as time moved forward, so did the desire to build a stronger, more mindful community. Mary Rowland's Residence Council meetings evolved from a small, cautious circle into a robust forum where ideas flowed freely. Meetings took place in the clubhouse, the very room where Harriet's pleas had once gone unanswered. Now, it echoed with thoughtful discussion about ways to unite neighbors who had grown complacent in their quiet routines. They brainstormed a volunteer network to check on vulnerable residents, particularly the elderly, those with medical conditions, or anyone who found themselves alone and in need of a friendly face. The program was informally called Harriet's Helpers. Neighbors began signing up eagerly. Frank offered to lead a small group that would visit each condo building twice a week, just to say hello or handle small tasks. Serena proposed a monthly potluck where people could gather, share recipes, and keep an eye on how everyone was faring. The maintenance team pledged to keep an emergency contact list updated, ensuring that if someone needed help at odd hours, they wouldn't be left to fend for themselves. This newfound solidarity wasn't without its tensions. After all, the old friction with the board remained. Howard, who had resigned as HOA president shortly after Harriet's funeral, attended the meetings quietly, sitting near the back. He rarely spoke, but his guilt was palpable. Even so, Mary insisted on including him, reminding everyone that redemption often begins with remorse. Some longtime residents, protective of Harriet's memory, balked at the idea of letting Howard participate. But Mary, though still grieving her friend, explained that shutting out individuals rarely fosters healing. The fact is, Mary said softly during one meeting, Howard's decisions set off a tragic chain of events. But we can't pretend that labeling him alone as the villain ends this problem. Harriet's gone. We owe it to her to change our community in a lasting way. And maybe that means giving everyone, even those who erred, a chance to do better. No one forgot Harriet, and no one forgave the callous indifference that led to her death. But people did, in a sense, learn from it. Younger families began pairing up with older neighbors, forming an unofficial buddy system. The once rigid lines between the older generation and the younger seemed to blur in the face of shared sorrow. Even the children got involved, brightening up the stairwells with simple artwork displayed on corkboards. One child's scribbled message read, "Light for Harriet," pinned next to a crayon picture of a smiling woman standing in a shining hallway. When county officials concluded their investigation, they determined that while Maplewood Gardens had met the bare minimum legal requirements, turning off the lights still created an environment of heightened risk. For a while, rumors of a lawsuit raged, but in the end, Harriet's daughter chose a different path. She filed a civil claim against the HOA, not out of vengeance, but to ensure that financial accountability matched moral responsibility. The settlement process would likely be long and fraught with legal back and forth, but the message was clear. Harriet's life had value far beyond a budget line item. In the face of these proceedings, the HOA board underwent a thorough overhaul. Elections were called early, new candidates stepped forward, and the residents' council gained official recognition. Mary herself was urged to run for a seat on the board, but she politely declined, preferring to act as an unofficial guide for the entire community. Instead, she supported two of her fellow volunteers, Serena and Frank, who campaigned on platforms of transparency, empathy, and improved safety measures. On Election Day, the turnout was unprecedented. Ballots filled the clubhouse boxes, and a new guard swept in by a landslide. An electric energy coursed through Maplewood Gardens that evening, reminiscent of Harriet's warmth and generosity, as folks celebrated the dawn of a new era. The new board immediately passed a resolution to maintain adequate lighting at all hours, to hold periodic safety audits, and to establish a designated fund for emergency preparedness. Walking down the now brightly lit stairs, Mary sometimes felt Harriet's presence. She would linger for a moment, resting a hand on the railing, recalling the flash of Harriet's smile, the gentle pitch of her laughter. She found herself determined to safeguard that memory. In the glow of those lights, she could practically hear Harriet's voice urging her forward. "Look out for one another, dear. You never know who might need a helping hand." The day the official plaque arrived, commissioned by residents' donations, people gathered for a short ceremony. It reads simply, "In memory of Harriet Malone, a kind soul who showed us that a community stands stronger in the light." A hush followed as people pressed flowers to the plaque, some wiping tears, others gazing down the hallway that had once been so dark. The hush broke into a solemn applause, not a celebration of Harriet's death, but a tribute to her life and what it had meant for all of them. In time, Maplewood Gardens, while still carrying the memory of its tragedy, became known in the county as a model for how to handle communal living with compassion and foresight. The Residents' Council, Harriet's helpers, and the newly reformed HOA board work hand in hand, ensuring safety and wellness always came before the bottom line. It didn't erase the past, but it honored Harriet's memory in a way that allowed healing. For Mary Rowland, life continued in the condo across from Harriet's now vacant unit. She would sometimes see the lights glowing at midnight and feel a bittersweet relief knowing that, had they been on before, Harriet might still be here, crocheting baby blankets, delivering casseroles, offering her kindly advice. Yet amid the sorrow was a quiet pride. The darkness that once threatened to swallow them had given way to understanding. In a place like Maplewood Gardens, every resident's well-being counted. And because of one woman's tragic fall, they had all learned to stand tall, together, in the light.